Welcome to Frontier, an investment podcast by Foresight, where we discuss strategies, trends, and challenges shaping private market funds. Welcome to episode 4 of the Frontier podcast, a podcast produced by Foresight Group and hosted by myself, Dan Wells, and my co-host, Chris Holmes. Chris and I are both partners at Foresight Group, and our job is to make investments into sustainable infrastructure in the energy transition. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the crucial world of interconnectors, giant power cables, and the role that they have to play in addressing bottlenecks in the energy transition. We're going to be discussing the fundamentals of interconnectors, the impact on energy security, and how they enable cross-border energy trade. We're delighted today that our guest is Simon Ludlam, who's the CEO of MaresConnect. Simon is going to be providing valuable insights to us into the development and implementation of these interconnector projects, talking about some of the challenges and the opportunities that we see there and the role that they have in scaling this critical infrastructure in the global energy transition. Simon's expertise lies in power generation, transmission and distribution networks, both in gas and power. He's worked in regulated assets and on complex structured investments. He has over 20 years of experience within private equity and infrastructure. And crucially, previously, he helped develop both the Green Link and the ElecLink interconnectors, two very important interconnector cables within the European energy transition. So we're delighted to be joined by Simon today. Chris, before we get into the conversation with Simon, just checking in. How's life with you, Chris? Any sporting exploits recently at all?
It's hello, Dan. Yeah, good to be back on the podcast. Time flies, doesn't it? Since the last one, I've actually had a quiet week. I think it's sort of coming to the end of the sporting season for me. That the weather's changing. Autumn is certainly here in the UK, and it's taking a bit more motivation for me to get outside on the bike, I must admit. So. But no harm done with a bit of relaxation and some reflection on the year gone by.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to wear a light this morning for the first time on my morning run. So that's the kind of bellwether that it's the mornings are getting darker. We've been through the equinox now, so it's now the nights are longer than the days. So yeah, the weather's changing. But it seems like a long time ago that only a week ago we were doing our infrastructure team charity run in aid of a fantastic charity called Walking for Hope, which helps young people with mental health challenges address those challenges by spending time in nature. And the two of us and the rest of the team were pounding the streets of London. And it was a hot day, Chris, wasn't it, actually, a week ago?
It was, and I must admit, we seem to have a habit of picking the one of the hottest days of the year for our charity event, because of course, as you recall, we did exactly the same thing almost at the same time last year, and that was well over 30 degrees when the Foresight infrastructure team headed out to the Shard and off for our walks or our runs, and it was quite a challenge, I must admit. And actually, it sort of links back to our earlier discussions, doesn't it, Dan, in terms of climate change and impact on sport. It's another hot day when we're out and about on the streets, walking and running, and making our bodies sort of push a little bit harder given those temperatures. So it was certainly quite a poignant event for that reason. But as you say, fantastic charity, Walking for Hope, set up by a gentleman, John Bell, in memory of his son, and all centred around mental health, getting out, connecting with nature and being with other people and focusing on well-being. I thought it was a fantastic day for our team to get out of the office and enjoy a bit of time together, talking and having some fun, but also doing it all for a very good cause.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we did take our we took our kind of climate mitigation within sports role seriously, Chris, didn't we? We stopped off actually in a couple of pubs on the route to cool down.
Well, the one you found tucked away in the back streets of central London did actually probably didn't surprise me, Dan, that you knew where it was, because clearly you spent many a time sneaking away and enjoying a quiet drink or two in there. But it was good to stop off, wasn't it, and actually have, in that instance, some ice water rather than a cold pint of beer, which was awaiting at the end.
That's right. A good shout out to the Grenadier pub there in Belgravia, one of my favourite haunts. And I believe, in fact, the Grenadier was where the idea for the Grenadier hydrogen power car was cooked up some time ago. So there we go. More references to the energy transition. So let's bring our guest Simon in. Simon, good morning. It's good to have you on the Frontier Show. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Pouring with rain outside, but other than that, I'm good to go.
Simon, have you been for a run today at all yet?
No, it's raining so much. I went and sort of moved large, heavy weights around a gym and did some stretching. But maybe tomorrow. I
There
do
we
like
go.
to run.
So yeah, Simon. So obviously you're a runner. You're in the energy space. Lots to talk about there. Maybe we can kick off with we're talking about a bit about your passion for running and on your runs. Do you think about what do you think about on your runs? Are you thinking about energy and the future of the world and things like that?
I do like to run. It's something I've always done, something I like to do competitively. I do find that taking a thorny problem with me over 40 minutes with the tester and going, I tend to look at problems in maybe a slightly different way than I would if I'm sitting at my desk. And I find that quite therapeutic. And maybe after 40 minutes, I found perhaps not the answer, but another way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all find that, don't we? It's like just getting away, getting out of the office, getting away from your computer, suddenly gives you kind of more perspective on things, and you can see the big picture. And I think that's very relevant for what we're talking about today. The big picture is really kind of what interconnection and interconnectors are all about. At Foresight, when we talk about the energy transition, having all these different components that we need to build, all these different types of infrastructure, obviously we need to massively scale up renewable energy in all its forms. We need much more flexibility in the energy system in the form of storage. But also, if we're going to efficiently and effectively meet our decarbonisation targets, we need a system that is big and it is joined up. The best renewable resources are often in remote places. It might be onshore wind in places like Texas or Western China that essentially have low populations but great wind resources. It could be the solar resources of southern Europe. It could be the offshore wind resources in the North Sea or in the future off the west coast of Ireland. And these renewable resources all need to be connected together. When we were running last week, Chris, on our run, when it was hot there, somewhere else it would have been raining or windy. So it's always going to be sunny or windy somewhere, but for the system to work as a whole, as a kind of big orchestra, it needs to be connected, and that's obviously the basis for building interconnection between grids. So Simon, maybe just to kick off a couple of questions. How critical are interconnectors, would you say, in achieving a fully integrated energy market in Europe?
Look, I think the European Union has long held out that this is the way to go forward. So they've put in place the concept of an integrated energy market, and that is core to their energy policy. And it was ours until we exited Brexit, but hopefully we still we're still keen on the core idea. So the internal energy market was based on a fully interconnected market, and therefore they put in place a whole swathe of regulation and legislation that would precipitate and push and promote interconnecting all the member states, including at the time Great Britain. So I think it's absolutely core. It remains a core pillar of their continuing energy strategy. And the UK, sitting in the middle of the North Sea, is obviously an essential part. When you ask them, what are those core things? They want energy security. We all want that, obviously, so that when somebody's got a problem, the other can come and fix it. They want to integrate renewable energy sources. So this is another way, picking up on your point, Dan, not only are a lot of these resources maybe a long way away, but the other key thing is there's often quite low correlation between two places. So it might be windy in Ireland, but not windy in the North Sea. It clearly leads to market efficiency. If it's high price in France and a low price in the UK, clearly it's beneficial to wind consumer or wind producers in France to export to wind producers in the UK to export to France. So we can lead to some smoothing of peaks and troughs of power. And then lastly, the more we can interconnect, the more we can bring RES on stream, and the greater probability we'll have of reaching our decarbonisation targets. So an emphatic yes, Dan, to your question.
Yeah, yeah. Good to hear, Simon, and that's the perspective today. And Simon, maybe you could give us a little bit of context then, just sort of going back into your past and your career. When did you first start becoming aware of the role that interconnectors might play, and when did you start thinking, yeah, this is an area where I'm going to focus a good chunk of my energy in my career?
Yeah, even in banking, I was quite involved in decarbonisation. I think decarbonisation is a long path. So when I started early on, we were looking to take heavy fuel oil out of sort of some of the big cities of the world. So we were looking at bringing gas to replace heavy fuel oil in, say, capitals like Bogota, Manila, Bangkok, and we did a lot of work at Lima, bringing those on. But I think that gets you one step. But then you need to remove the gas in the next step. So when I moved into private equity is not very good normally at taking commodity risk, and therefore the shift goes away from looking at the sort of the ultimate source or gas fields or oil fields, and then moving really into infrastructure. And I started to look very carefully at what I would call pinch point infrastructure that can't be bypassed, even if you rip up all the contracts around it. That always struck me as a sort of a good economic thesis in which to invest. So we started looking at interconnection probably around 2010, and got quite close on one project. But then I noticed that there were some quite challenges to interconnection. Whilst I could see that in Europe there was significant arbitrage, particularly with France having sort of low value nuclear and being able to export that to higher price markets such as the UK, which was predominantly gas. I could see that if you had problems, you needed to get a lot of people to agree. You needed to get lots of landowners to agree, people in the sea to agree, governments, regulators. So started focusing on where would be a logical place where you have one landowner or maybe very limited landowners. Maybe you've got infrastructure already, so you could have some interoperability, and that led you very quickly to the Channel Tunnel. And so I looked at that and I thought, I was going backwards and forwards on the Eurostar all the time for my private equity work. I thought, how could we do something else with this tunnel? Because we must be able to do something. And it just became immediately clear from the other project I was working on, the best place to do it would be on the border with France, where we had very strong arbitrage. And another point we haven't brought up is that the hour difference between GB and continental Europe actually makes a big difference. So we're chatting away here at 9 o'clock, and a lot of us are sort of finishing off our breakfast. But in France, they're well into the working day, and their peak is long gone. And so just that hour difference makes a big difference in the flows of electricity between GB and continental Europe. So anyway, a long-winded answer to say, it was a progressive thing over many years, but really, I think it was the link that really inspired me to push on with this.
Thank you, Simon. That's really interesting in terms of your background, and actually, just that last point you made about the hour difference just hit home to me. Actually, because I've traditionally thought about managing the intermittency of renewables across different countries, as we spoke about at the beginning. The wind isn't blowing somewhere, the sun might be shining in another region. We can manage the flows, but actually timing differences and the demand side of things from the energy system also plays a crucial role here. So to me, was an interesting point you made there. I do wonder, actually, maybe now is a good time to bring up our poll, just to perhaps set the scene a little bit on the conversation. We can pick up some of the themes as well coming out of this. So as ever with our podcast, we do want to engage with our listeners and find out what topics they would like to focus a little bit more on in these podcasts with our guests. And for this one, we asked our listeners, what do you think is the biggest challenge to scaling up energy interconnectors in the energy transition? And we provided 4 possible answers. One was lack of investment in infrastructure. Another was cross-border coordination. Then we had policy and regulatory barriers. And then the last was cost and financing challenges. So all, you would argue, very relevant. But of course, there needs to be one which sits at the top of the pile. And that's been quite clearly the lack of investment in infrastructure at 41%. So, and that I guess, statement covers quite a few areas in itself. But these are big, costly pieces of infrastructure, Simon. What's your take of attracting private capital and indeed government support and capital from public bodies as well into these huge infrastructure projects, which clearly have a very important role to play?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But the poll is very interesting. I suppose as a developer, I look at the bottom 3. Those are the 3 I live with every single day. And I think those 3, when you combine them together, then leads you to the first one. That difficulty in getting governments to agree, or getting interconnect or regulators to agree on things. And at the moment we're going through a huge spike in prices with the supply chain. These three combined probably means that it's difficult to get the investment into interconnectors that we would like at the speed we would like. There's no doubt about it, at the top of the pile, if you go to the Commission, if you go to the government here in Westminster, they would like to see more interconnection. They say it over and over again, and they see the clear benefits of it. But ultimately, interconnectors are quite political. I would say that when a country looks down that cable, they maybe see different things from the people looking down at the other end. And so one of the skills is to try and bring the two groups together where they have a shared interest, maybe not for exactly the same reasons, but ultimately the benefit of the cable is strong. Get them together. Each country has its own regulatory regime. That's a little bit tricky as well. Now, you would say, well, in the European Union it's the same, but actually when you get into the detail of each country, there's always a slight differences. And we need to get a common regulatory perspective in order to get an underlying credit revenue model such that the asset can get financed. And this is obviously key for private capital. Nobody's going to come in and just take 100% merchant risk, unless of course you're Electlink, on a project. The projects, they're upwards of $1 billion these days, even a small one. So €1 billion is a significant amount of money, and therefore there needs to be some sort of regulatory regulatory policy in place on both sides of the cable in order to get it financed. And then I just would say a quick word to the cost and financing challenges. Post-Ukraine, we have seen such a large spike in prices for both cable and for converter stations. This, I think, has meant that perhaps marginal projects fall away. I think it also reflects that the OEMs, they're not that many of them in Tier 1. They're extremely busy with the TSOs developing projects to reinforce onshore grids and a number of bootstraps, and therefore it's quite challenging at the moment to get their attention and get cable slots or converter station slots. So there's quite a lot of inflation in the market at the moment. Coming back to your question, Chris, where can private capital come into this? I think this is key, is that ultimately there is so much to be done. Objective in front of us is so great, 300 gigawatts in the North Sea, that no one or group of TSOs is in any way in a position to finance that. And many TSOs are government owned. So that in itself is, puts the burden back onto the state. I think the other thing worth pointing out is that once you get offshore, some TSOs are not natural investors, and some TSOs are not allowed to invest in foreign territory. So, for example, the French TSO RTE can't invest outside of France. So I think that leads to sort of a natural void and a gap for private capital to come in and bridge that gap. Take risk that a lot of the TSOs, perhaps not used to going offshore, come in, provide capital for that, and bridge both politically and physically these different markets.
Lots to dive into, Simon. Thanks for that overview. One of the topics there you mentioned was around policy, and of course, private capital looking for confidence and certainty that's supported by clear government policy, legislation, even a subsidy regime in some cases in our sectors that we invest into is extremely important to bring in the amount of private capital that's needed in these hugely significant infrastructure projects. For the benefit of our listeners, would you mind just perhaps setting the scene a little bit in terms of where the policy landscape sits at the moment between the UK and Europe? Obviously, a region of focus at the moment, and perhaps even your wish list of where that might end up to address this capital gap that we have in front of us.
Yeah. It's multifaceted and multi-layered, as you can imagine. I think we just start at the top. There is a commonality of purpose to decarbonise. That remains right at the top of this current administration, with the appointment of Chris Stark to run, mission control for 2030. Ed Miliband has repeated often that he would like to see decarbonisation accelerated for GB. And these are just simply echoed back into the Commission as well. So decarbonisation is absolutely key. Within the Commission, as I mentioned before, there are roughly 10 major pieces of legislation and regulation that point to a firm commitment to decarbonise by 2030. So I think in terms of policy, it's clear. In terms of how we can implement, which is the more difficult thing, is that and you took the example of Great Britain and continental Europe, is that when the United Kingdom exited from Brexit, we were left with the TCA, the Transition Cooperation Agreement. I hope I've got that right. Correct me if I'm wrong. And that had an element in it, a schedule right at the back if you ever choose to read it, about how we would continue to work together. That's never been implemented, and we're 2 years late, and it may never be implemented. I know there are groups working on it, but this would be key to us trying to work together in a more formalized way of putting further interconnection in. So I think that's there in the background, and the teams are working on it. I think probably what's happening sort of in parallel to that is that private developers such as MaresConnect, with the support of Foresight, and there are other projects out there as well. I think your friends Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners and others are working on this as well, is that privately we'll try and get on in spite of maybe these challenges around not so much the policy, but the implementation of it, is to keep driving projects, because everybody can see their benefits, both from a decarbonisation perspective and also their interesting investments. So from an economic perspective. So we'll continue to drive forward.
I mean, it might be a good moment, just give a bit more kind of specific context on MaresConnect. Obviously, every interconnector has got a different business model, a different kind of basis for it. If it's a cable that's being built between North Africa to Europe, you're obviously linking up that solar resource with Europe. If it's an interconnector between France and the UK, you're connecting two very different power systems, one underpinned by nuclear power, one with a much more varied mix. What's the basis for MaresConnect itself, and what's the underlying business model there?
So when the MaresConnect team previously worked on Greenlink, which is another interconnector between Ireland and Wales that was energised, or at least testing, last Friday. So we're very excited about that. It's good news. But I think during that process of working through that, what we saw was that when you really get into the weeds and really start analysing power flows at a half-hourly basis, is that wind is a key driver for interconnection across the Irish Sea. So what we see is repeatable wind patterns coming off the Atlantic depressions, which hit the west of Ireland, and then they move steadily in a sort of northeasterly direction, going across the island of Ireland, and then moving across into the sea, and then into the UK. And these patterns sort of repeat themselves, and they generate between 4 and 6 hours of really very strong wind. Ireland, we know, is windy, and basically 60% of the time there is enough wind to generate wind farms to produce electricity. And once the wind gets to around 10 meters per second, which for sailors out there is a nice strong breeze, it means that inevitably we will see wind power being exported from Ireland into the UK. And we see that, and we see it every day. And so as we dug into this, we thought, actually, this border is the really interesting one. This one's going to be absolutely key going forward, because we know that Ireland is going to develop further offshore wind. They've got one of the best resources in Europe, and what the rest of Europe wants is green power. And therefore, we've got a source relatively close to home that can get to people who need it quickly, and further interconnection is going to be required. It's not going to be an interconnector, so like the French ones, which run 24/7 to arbitrage nuclear against gas. This is going to work for 4 to 6 hours when those Atlantic depressions come, and they come often. And during that time, wholesale prices will probably drop. It's a relatively small economy, 1/10 the size of the UK. Prices drop, and therefore there's a sort of an immediate arbitrage between Ireland and the UK. UK being the much higher steady market at around sort of 80 euros per megawatt hour, and we need to get that power to the UK. So there's an interesting perspective economically, but from a green perspective, it's exactly what the UK wants. good, strong green power from a renewable resource.
I think it's such a good illustration there of a specific kind of business case underpinning a specific interconnector, but it's one component of this kind of much wider kind of tapestry as we look across Europe or the world in terms of why interconnection makes so much sense. What about technology here? Obviously, we've been putting up cables for decades. Transmission networks are, in some cases, almost 100 years old. Is the technology of cables evolving at all? Will it evolve in the future? Is that an important consideration at all from your perspective?
I think it's an important perspective actually for the investor. As you said, cable technology has been around for a very long time. We've had interconnectors for a long time, and we use, for our listeners, high voltage direct current. So we're not sending it AC, we're sending it direct current. And the reason we do that is we can send very large quantities, volumes of power with very low losses. And something that our listeners might not know is that Great Britain is not in phase with any of its neighbours. The sine curve, you can't just overlap them. They're slightly out of phase. So if you wanted to inject AC from GB into France, it would just blow up. So we don't do that. So we have to send it direct current, and then we reconstruct the sine wave in many little parts through a set of valves to produce a perfect sine wave that can be received into the local grid. So that's why we do it through HVDC. That has developed over time, and so I would say that we're at a place now where that technology is relatively mature. And I think in terms of when we're investing very large amounts of money, banks don't want to be taking increasing technology risk above all the other risks that they've got of having to go offshore different jurisdictions. So the technology is relatively mature. In terms of cables, it's always improving. I think probably people think about it always being copper. Given copper's so expensive, we tend to be moving towards aluminium. Obviously, doesn't have quite the same resistivity, so we have slightly thicker cables. But again, for your readers, they're probably thinking, well, what do these look like? The two cables are no bigger, the cores of the cable are no bigger than that coffee cup sitting in front of you on the desk. And in terms of when you put all the, the insulation and armor around it, it's no bigger than a dinner plate. So you've got two dinner plates that have diameter cables transmitting, the equivalent of a very large power plant from one place to another. All the cables are underground, I should say that as well. So everything's underground, and undersea as well. So we protect the environments we go at, and people are not seeing pylons, so that's important. And then the converter stations are sort of just very large, modern-looking barns. And again, they tend to be sited close to an existing substation. So we're not going to a sort of a virgin piece of land and destroying that environment. We're going somewhere very close that's already industrialized and plugging straight into the substation.
And Simon, in terms of the time taken to complete these infrastructure projects, clearly to some extent, or maybe to a large extent, dominated by the complexity of the cable, the length of the cable, the countries involved. But perhaps using MaresConnect as an example here, how long would you say it would take, almost from, clearly you've been involved with it for some time, but from start to finish? I mean, because this is quite an important point, when we start to look at our 2030 targets. You mentioned Chris Stark there earlier, and Labour's new mission control really focused and very heavily on meeting our 2030 goal from the UK standpoint. Yet, here we are talking about some crucial infrastructure that will clearly play a role in meeting those targets. But yet, time perhaps isn't on our side. It'll be useful just to understand, the timing implications for these projects.
Yeah, maybe starting from backwards. What we're seeing is that the OEMs who provide this technology, the ABBs, the Hitachis, the Siemens of this world, and then in the cables, Prysmian, Nexans, and NKT, so the tier one players here. They're extremely professional, extremely good, and on MaresConnect they've delivered sort of on time, and it's about a 36-month construction period. So for a relatively short, not a huge size cable, we're looking at about a 3-year sort of construction period. Before that, in theory, if everything goes well, the planning should only, the planning and the sort of consenting and the whole development phase shouldn't take much more than 3 years either. But I think what we're seeing is that's taking longer, increasingly longer. So we rarely see during the construction phase some huge hiccup that delays the project by a year. They're under turnkey EPC contracts and they tend to deliver on time. So I think the problem really comes from trying to get two different regulators to go into lockstep to agree a regulatory model for the project, and often it'll be two different types of regulation. So in MaresConnect we work in Greenlink we worked really hard to implement cap and floor into the Irish regulation so that we could have cap and floor regulation across the Irish Sea. And as best we could, it was symmetrical between GB and Ireland, so that when the banks look at it, they see a single credit. That was a key driver right from the get-go. But those things take a long time to put in place, and longer than we'd hoped. And then after that, planning and permitting is a subject which I'm sure our listeners have heard 100 times, and I'm sure other guests that will come on the program will talk about. It's just very tricky to get in two different jurisdictions to get these permits on time. It takes a long time, and despite all of the legislation, all of the political will to get this to go faster, I think as we, quite normally as we move into the 21st century, people are increasingly aware of their environment and wanting to protect it, and so these things are just taking longer and longer, and more scrutiny goes into reviewing them. So there's another long-winded answer to say, we're less worried about the construction period, more worried about the development period and just making sure we get the permits and the regulation on time.
I was talking to a diver who dives off the west coast of Scotland recently, and he was saying that his local diving club now specifically go to an area where they know there is a power cable on the seabed because it's created a really interesting marine ecosystem around it. So, interesting to think about the kind of the interaction of these cables with nature restoration as well in future. Just want to zoom out for a minute, Simon, and give more a kind of global perspective. So I think increasingly the role of interconnection is being really well recognised in policy at a national level, at the EU level. I mean, just taking the Europe and the US as kind of two examples. In the last few months, we've seen another wave of kind of clean energy policy support in Europe. We've seen things like the report that Mario Draghi has written for the EU, which is basically explaining that clean energy lies at the heart of competitiveness for Europe. So Europe kind of staying competitive in the future relies on clean energy, and the key words that keep coming up there, and also in things like new guidelines for the European Investment Bank, the new guidelines for the European Commission, the three key words that keep coming up are storage, grid, and interconnection as being kind of fundamental to this. In the US, in the wake of the Inflation Reduction Act, that essentially has made loads of it's given loads of carrots essentially to clean energy kind of buildings in the form of tax credits. In the wake of that, there is a real focus on interconnection through, for example, through the federal regulator, through FERC, and a number of orders that are intended to connect up the US. Again, if you think of the US a bit like Europe, it's like the US as a whole has got all the resources it needs. It's got lots of sun and wind, but in different places. It's half a dozen different energy systems which aren't well interconnected between them. A few cables between, for example, California and Texas will make a huge difference in terms of the cost of decarbonisation there. So we are seeing this support because it's necessary, as you said. That permitting is such a key issue. It's a real challenge in terms of the timeline of these projects. If we fast forward today, Simon, to the day when you are global dictator with complete and absolute power in terms of how infrastructure is implemented across the world, which I'm sure you will agree is a highly likely scenario in the near future. How do you see the role of interconnectors globally? I mean, clearly, as discussed, they've got an important role to play in Europe. What about kind of just across the world? Like, where do you see the strengths of interconnectors? What's their limitations? Like, how long is too long in terms of power cables? How do you see their role in comparison to, say, other forms of energy transportation? So, for example, using hydrogen as an energy vector, transporting energy over long distances in the form of, say, liquid hydrogen or other areas. And do you have a kind of a sort of overall feeling of what the role of interconnectors might look like on a global basis in the future?
Well, Dan, thank you for that very short question. I guess maybe start with a couple of principles. One is that I'm going to talk my own book, so spoiler alert here. Ultimately, what I like about interconnection is that it takes res the moment it's produced and takes it to the person who needs it, with no interference, no bifurcations through whatever other process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But as an interconnector guy, what you want to do is take the energy where it's produced and get it to the person who wants it. And we see that as sort of our key role. Now, a government probably will look at it slightly differently for many reasons. They may want to stimulate industry in their own in their own state, and that could be done by trapping that energy and then developing maybe an energy intensive business around it. So, for example, we'll take Ireland as a good example. They have managed to stimulate a lot of tech investment on the back of having data centers, and the data center community will tell you what we want power security, and we want it to be green. So where better to go than Ireland for that? So you can have some of that power stored or used in the state before it goes somewhere else. Hydrogen's another good example, and hydrogen in many respects is a simple competitor to interconnectors. Either you're going to ship the power to somebody who needs it, or you're going to keep it onshore and turn it into another derivative power that can be stored and then taken somewhere else, either locally or shipped somewhere else. So we look at all of these as just as being inevitable bedfellows as we go forward to the ultimate goal of decarbonisation. Talking more about interconnectors in the future, we're beginning to see some further interconnection projects which are much more ambitious and grander in scale. And I think I can split them up into two parts. One of them is where you've got, as you said right at the beginning, perhaps a resource, whether it's solar in a very remote part of the world, say Darwin or Morocco, wind in Morocco as well, where the local economy would not really be able to absorb any of that. So logically, we're taking the power from those areas to a demand center that can certainly consume it. It's unlikely, or highly unlikely, that the power would reverse flow. So at the moment, if we take Xlink's a good example, the huge development of both wind and solar taken north into Europe, where there's a huge demand, but the bottom desert part of Morocco, there's very little. So they're really kind of transmission cables, and Darwin to Singapore is another example. So we could see these begin to develop as long line, I call them interconnectors, but they're using HVDC, so they're using a very similar technology. And I think what they present is interesting technical challenges because the cable lengths are so long. They're going through relatively, potentially quite deep oceans, which is technology that we're only just developing now. And on top of that, very long distances, inevitably their losses. So in terms of making sure they're efficient and economically viable, we need to take that into account. There are a couple of other interconnectors that are developing which are really interconnectors. So there's been rumors about maybe linking Oman and India. That's interesting, and we really like these east-west interconnectors because here we're playing on the sun. And another one that's emerging, and one that we're a little bit involved in, is called NATOL. So where it would go from the North Sea to the east coast of North America. And what we've got there is we've got a differential of 6 hours. Which means that when the sun is at its zenith here in Europe, when we're producing maximum amount of solar, actually we're not using so much power, and we tend to have a surplus. But in New York, they're having breakfast, and so we can get it to them when they need it. And then 6 hours later, they're at their zenith, and we're all coming home hungry, ravenous, and we're putting the kettle on, and we reverse flow. And as an interconnector guy, I keep saying this, shouldn't say, I love to see a 4-hump day curve, because a 4-hump day curve means that it's highly likely that over time I'm going to have reverse flows, maybe 2 or 3 times during the day. And that means flow, and that means revenue, and that means also arbitrage of prices, and importantly, come back to the original discussion, it means that we're displacing probably a gas molecule somewhere, and we're decarbonising.
And that's really interesting to hear about the different aspects around the world, in terms of whether it's a connection just to take energy from one place to the other, or whether it's truly a byway interconnector where, as you say, you can benefit from different aspects in different countries and the flow going both ways. And I do wonder in terms of that change in flow of energy through the system, and the reliance on system operators and other technology, computer systems at either end, just to determine what is best. You mentioned price arbitrage there, and I was reading an article in the FT a couple of weeks ago, which admittedly focused more on batteries and sort of short-term reaction to energy demand on the system, and switching over where power prices or generation dictates a certain part of the system is better at delivering that power than others. But how would you see the technology on either side, and almost the other organisations involved, if you like, in making those decisions, Simon?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've all got a role to play. And even on this call, we've all got a role to play, I think. So the role of the TSOs will remain central and should be. And, I applaud the government's decision to separate the SO from National Grid. I think that's an extremely good idea, where we have a really dedicated government-owned entity that's solely out there to ensure that the grid in the UK responds and is fit for purpose. I think that's a good step forward. So their role is to respond to the point you just made. They will require further capital, as you said, as we become increasingly what we call non-synchronous. So res power tends to be non-synchronous, and related to that, we have different challenges on the grid to make sure that we remain within 50 hertz with all the security parameters to make sure the grid is always good to go and doesn't wobble on those difficult moments. That responsibility clearly lies with the SO or whoever it delegates that responsibility. National Grid energy transmission at the moment, so electricity transmission at the moment. So I think that needs to be looked at. I think interconnectors can play a part in that. We can provide momentum to the system when needed, inertia, and we provide lots of ancillary services through in a competitive way for black start or the capacity market, fast frequency response and other things. But I think, coming back to your point, it's key that the SO takes on that role and that they have the capital, or they can at least call on capital to implement the new types of technology, the new types of equipment that we will need to respond to a highly non-synchronous system in the future.
Simon, this conversation is fantastic and mind expanding. I've just got one final question from my side before we sum up. When you're thinking of new ideas, what's more effective to your thinking? And I know that you also are a wine lover. So my question to you is, you're coming up with a new idea. Is it a glass of wine, or is it a run in the countryside that's going to give you the best mental space to think about that?
Well, if I'm honest, of course, it's running around, given the blood's pumping through that important organ. Hopefully the best ideas come together. But actually, now you think about it, and you were talking about running. A couple of weeks ago, I did do the Marathon of Medoc, which maybe your listeners know, but it's where you run a marathon through 25 of the wine growing chateaus in Bordeaux. And if you want, you can stop every 2 kilometers and have a little sip of wine. So perhaps that's the ultimate, isn't it? Where you're running, having a little drink from time to time. I only stop at the great chateaus, obviously Lafitte, Felon-Segur, Le Chevel. But yeah, and perhaps that helps in stimulating some good ideas.
I think we have an idea for our next charity run there, Dan. So we'll put a marker down for that one.
Exactly. Fantastic. Right. Thank you, Simon. We'll wrap things up. So certainly the things that I took away from this conversation were multiple. First of all, that the answer to having the best ideas is to run, and it sounds like drink expensive wine as well, Simon. So I think Chris and I are definitely in for that. I think we've taken away from this conversation just the role that interconnectors have to play in the energy transition and what they can do in terms of facilitating just reductions in the costs of decarbonisation. We've talked about the importance, though, of policy support, the fact that you need many actors coming together, obviously the private sector, ourselves, putting money to work, but also governments and policymakers, energy system regulators, energy system operators. It's a very large and wide-ranging conversation of many actors to make this work and to get through some of the challenges, in particular things like permitting these very large infrastructure projects. There were two main things that I took away from the conversation, though. The first is this notion of creating what you might call an energy system that's bigger than the weather. Simon, you talked through essentially the fact that if you build your energy system big enough, then you have non-correlated weather patterns, and you're able to have, therefore, a much more kind of resilient and consistent energy system. And the second main takeaway I took was the role that interconnectors have in essentially everyone being able to do what they do best and contribute to the system. So if you're in an area, if you're a country with solar resources, you can contribute. With wind resources, you can contribute. If you have ways of storing energy through things like pumped hydro, you can contribute to the system, as long as we're all connected up. So from my perspective, I'd like to thank you, Simon, for what has been a fantastic conversation, and certainly one which I have learned a lot in.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon.